I'm going to talk about a little project that the Parks Department is doing in the Greenbelt, one that's not exactly important to me, but it's a place that I really like. It's the Serpentine Barrens that are between Moses Mountain and Seaview Hospital. This is a tiny project, nothing big, and the area is pretty tiny too. This little green dot right there, that little green dot is a lot bigger than the project area. Many, many times bigger. The Serpentine Barrens I'm going to talk about is only about 150 feet across. It's not big at all. This is what the Barrens looked like a few years ago. Some of you may have seen this, have been familiar with it. If you walk across the Blue Trail, go across Rockland towards Seaview, eventually you will come past this little patch. You would walk past a little unmarked trail that went up the hill to Seaview Hospital where the old men's pavilions were, and you'd pass right through this little Barrens area. This is 2019. The Barrens are kind of important because it's a rare habitat. There's not very many of them, these Serpentine Barrens, worldwide. Now, there are lots of different kinds of barrens. Barrens are places where there are few plants, or only a select number of plants. Most plants can't grow on the barrens for one reason or another. Some of the barrens are barren because it's pretty much all rock. Plants can't get a root, so not many grow. Some of them may grow on dry, sandy soil where there's not enough water. Our barrens grow on what we call a soil that's derived from serpentine rock. Now, I got to go back a little ways to give you some background about serpentine. A little ways is going to be about 500 million years ago, maybe a little more. Not exactly yesterday, but quite a while away. At that time, most of what are going to become the continents that we're familiar with today were all arranged around an ocean, a very shallow ocean in the middle. And the deep ocean is on the other side of the globe. There's not too much land over there. And this shallow ocean is what created the Serpentine Barrens that we have today. If we go forward to about 250 million years ago or so, those floating proto-continents had moved together and they had squeezed out that sea. But in the meantime, rainwater had washed in minerals, all kinds of stuff from the surrounding land. The minerals sunk to the bottom of that sea. There were sea creatures and plants and so forth that were growing in that sea. The sediment sunk to the bottom. And then when these land masses moved together, they created a lot of pressure, which created serpentine soil. And on this depiction of the globe, these of course aren't real photographs because there was nobody around then to take a photograph. Here we have an outline of the United States up here. And down here we have an outline of Africa. Those are going to be the continents that would have formed. And right here, the Allegheny Mountains. They've been pushed up when these proto-continents collide, and the Allegheny Mountains at that time were kind of like the Rocky Mountains today. They were big, tall, high, not all kind of worn down like they are in our time. Finally, 200 million years ago or so, these plates began to drift apart, and the space in between, that's going to be the Atlantic Ocean eventually. It's got a few 100 million years to go, but we're going to get the Atlantic Ocean there. And Staten Island was right up here. When these plates pushed together, they squished that mineral-rich material from the bottom of that old ocean up against the sides of these newly developing continents. And that's going to be kind of important to us. I'm going to jump ahead a lot. Now we're yesterday. 20,000 years, a little more ago, the last of the great glaciers, ice sheets, kind of pushed its way down from the north and reached its greatest extent kind of right along a line, roughly right through the bottom of New York State, pretty much covering Staten Island. They tell us that just north of New York City, there was probably a mile of ice. That was a lot of ice, and it scraped Staten Island clean. That's going to be important for our Barrens story, too. When it scraped Staten Island clean, new soil had to be produced, and plants had to make their way back onto the island. And the soil that develops is very dependent on the rock and stuff underneath, what we call the parent material that degraded to eventually become the soil. In our barrens, there are a couple of places where the rock is protruding and you can actually see that greenish serpentinite rock. The thing about the soil that's produced is the plants that can grow there depend on what kind of soil it is. The soil that developed from rock that was produced at the bottom of those ancient oceans was full of a lot of kind of toxic in a way, minerals and elements. It was very rich, especially in magnesium, and it was kind of poor in calcium. That's important to the plants. Green plants need both magnesium and calcium. Magnesium, for example, there is a magnesium atom in a chlorophyll molecule. No magnesium, no chlorophyll, no green plants. We're all in trouble. But most plants need a whole lot of calcium and not much magnesium. And what we've got in that soil up there is kind of the reverse. So most plants can't live on that soil. Only a very few can. And in fact, there are some plants that only grow in the Serpentine Barrens. They're what we call endemic to the Serpentine Barrens. But we don't have any of those. We don't have any because the glaciers cleaned off the island, and then when plants tried to come back, the ones that were still in existence in Serpentine Barrens further to the south, in southeastern Pennsylvania, Virginia, and so forth, they couldn't get back. They're too far away. So what we have on our barrens are just some common plants, relatively common plants, that can deal with the soil. And some of the plants that we find in our barrens, they're kind of interesting. The two that I like especially are a little sedge down there called globe flat sedge. It's in the lower, let's see, for you it would be the lower right. And the upper left, the green comet milkweed, which now we just call green milkweed, because apparently it's all the same species of milkweed. The green comet milkweed, New York State regards as being a rare plant. It's what they call an S2 plant. The New York Natural Heritage Program does a ranking of plants and animals and habitats in New York for purposes of guiding the state in making its decisions. An S2 plant is the second rarest category. It goes from S1, the rarest, to S4, the most common. And the S2 plants, they are plants that occur in between 6 and 20 places in New York State. So it's not very common. So I'm kind of appreciative of that plant, even though I know, and I'm sure some of you know, that green comet milkweed is not an uncommon milkweed elsewhere. It's a very common milkweed in the Midwest. But in New York State, it's pretty rare. And the serpentine habitat is considered an S1 habitat by New York State, which means that there are 5 or less of those habitats in the entire state. And guess what? We have 5 of them. And they're all right here on Staten Island. Because the rock that made up that soil and so forth is pretty much buried in all the rest of the state, and it only comes to the surface once we get to Staten Island. So we have these serpentine barrens that are caused by that particular kind of rock. I don't know how well you can see these, probably better on this one. This is Rockland Avenue, Manor Road over here. Down here, this little paperclip looking like thing is Moses Mountain. Up here is Seaview, and the ruins of the old men's pavilions are right here. And kind of in between Moses Mountain and Seaview are the Barrens, a little tiny site. This is probably the second best barrens that we have on Staten Island. The best of them is over at the Serpentine Arts and Nature Commons over in Van Duzer. Those are the best of the barrens because the land over there is very, very steep. So whenever it rains, water is continually washing down, dissolving minerals, bringing those toxic minerals out of the rock, bathing the vegetation there, helping preserve the barrens. But the problem is, all of our barrens, including the ones there, are dying. They're disappearing. And they're disappearing because they're undergoing succession. You're all familiar with forest succession that often happens where grasslands, shrubs move in eventually, and then small trees and larger trees develop into forests and so forth. Same thing is happening on these serpentine barrens. Bare rock gets inhabited by some rather sturdy organisms, especially lichens. Lichens, if you didn't know it, the ones that grow on rocks, are capable of dissolving a lot of rock. They produce enzymes that will actually eat their way into the surface of the rock. So they create little cracks, the water gets in, it freezes, more cracks, more lichens, mosses move in and begin growing. They die, and their organic remains on top provides a place that grass seeds can come in and grasses can begin growing. So now we've got grasses growing in these barren places. And then the grasses die, they provide more organic matter. Eventually there's enough organic matter there that shrubs move in. Twigs fall, rot, leaves fall, rot, more organic matter. And pretty soon you have a big enough layer of organic matter on top of the barrens that the barrens are buried. And now trees are starting to grow. So the barrens are going away. It's a natural process. And this is actually happening even over in Van Duzer, but it's not happening as fast as it's happened right here in the Greenbelt. Parks decided they were going to do something about a project to see if they could restore the barrens. My question has always been, you're going to restore something, what are you going to restore it to? How far do you go back? If you're going to restore the barrens, you're going to try to take it back to before European colonists were over here, when only Native Americans might have been hunting along the island. Well, maybe you could do that if you could figure out what plants and things grew there. I don't think we have any evidence or any way to really know, unless we have a lot of money and we can get some scientists to go in and dig down through the soil and look at what pollen is in the soil to try to determine what the plants were back then. But that's expensive, and I don't think anybody's going to bother doing that. Or do we go back to maybe in the 50s and the 60s, where I've been told, I didn't live here then, that all of that hillside was a grassland. There were very few trees. When protectors and the organizations that came before protectors used to take walks through that area, they would go past these barrens, that hillside, and it was pretty much grass. Or do we look at maybe 100 years ago? What was it like 100 years ago? Well, here we have some evidence because we've got some aerial photographs that were taken back in 1924. And the Barrens is, the best that I can determine, is right about up in here. But you can see then, that was all fields. This was farmland and so forth for Seaview Hospital and the farm colony. And right beside the Barrens, you can see that little pattern of dots. Pretty obvious, that's an orchard. So the Barrens look nothing like what they look like today. So the first question is, when do you take it back to? Parks decided they were going to try to get it back to something like the Barrens at Van Duzer look like. So what they wanted to do was to halt the loss of the Barrens and maybe even bring it back, to reintroduce some of the plants that they think were on the Barrens, to expand the Barrens area a little bit because it's becoming very small, and maybe stop deer from cropping away at everything. And finally, what will turn out to be a big problem is to deal with the Japanese stiltgrass. 2 years ago, somebody said to me, hey, have you seen what the Parks is doing up there in the Serpentine Barrens? They brought in equipment and they're plowing everything away. And I thinking, that's nice to know. I'll have to see it myself before I really believe that something like that is happening up there. Well, so I went up there. Before I got there, the Barrens looked like this. Well, that rumor was not a rumor. When I finally got up there, the Barrens looked like that photograph on that side. And that little sign there says that the deer fencing has been put up with the little ribbons to keep deer from running into it, to prevent overgrazing of our forests by deer. And I went ballistic. And what the hell have they done here? And why? Where's the woods in there that they're protecting from the deer? What's going on? Don't they know that this is a rare habitat? I wrote letters to everybody I could think of. And I mean everybody I could think of. With few exceptions, they were email letters. So 2 days later, I immediately got a response from the Parks Department, from the person that's in charge of this project, apologizing for the signage. Apparently, those were the only signs they had. And explaining that this was a prototype project to see if they could restore the grasslands. What did they look like before? Well, 2 years before they began, the grasslands that we've been looking at looked like this. This is early spring. That's why it's all brown. And there's grass stubble there. They're all, most of them aren't native grasses, but they're common grasses to the Serpentine grasslands. But down in the other corner is a Barrens that's a little lower on the hillside. And all of that jumble of stuff there is Japanese stiltgrass, which has taken over that Barrens area. Here's the Parks Department plan. They said, we're going to come in, we're going to remove the trees around the edges because they're casting shade, they're producing leaves and so forth that's helping bury the Barrens. We're going to scrape the soil because we don't think we can get rid of the invasives and so forth, but we're going to kind of get a clean slate by scraping the soil and begin replanting there. I wasn't sure about that. Still not. Put up the deer fencing. We're going to control the invasives. We're going to plant natives. And we're going to monitor the site for 5 years to see what's going on and what we can change. This is the beginning of the project. They're taking a soil sample, a core, to see what minerals and so forth are in the soil, what depths and so forth. Well, big surprise to me, to them, to everybody. The first year after they scraped that area and started planting things, it looked like this. But if you went up close and you looked, something close to 95% of the plants there are Japanese stiltgrass. It was shocking. Everybody was shocked. Time to, what are we going to do now? What they wanted was eventually to bring in things like this. Native grasses and common grasses that are perennial, that you could plant a couple of years, and then from then on they would grow by themselves, send out runners, produce new clumps. But they got stilt grass. So what did they do? First year, they had to come in twice, just a couple of workers, because that's all they had, and hand weed that entire area. They pulled out the stilt grass by hand 2 times and began planting other things. This is from just a couple of months ago, when they were coming in to plant a few more grasses and a few more forbs. They were planting, for example, tick trefoil, that little plant down there in the corner. That's the plant I'm sure you're all familiar with if you ever go off the trail in grasslands toward the end of the season. It produces those little triangular green seeds that stick all over your clothes, so you have to kind of peel off. It's a native plant, though. By the way, interesting, they're all women. Virtually everyone working on this project is female. I don't know how that works out. They monitor. You've probably seen some of the flags up there. Pink ones and orange ones. The pink ones were the first year, orange ones were the second year. If you look closely around the flags, you find a little metal pin. The pin marks a monitoring place where once every year they would go in and they would make a survey of what plants were growing in a circle that was 1 meter square in area around each of these pins, and that's how they're going to keep track of the success or failure of this project. This is how it looked in September. Considerably different than it did a year ago. The tall white things are some kind of thoroughwort. You may be able to see a couple of little orange flags. You probably can't see all of the different goldenrods that are in there because they just don't show up very well in this photograph. And there are smaller plants too as well. And the sign no longer says that they're keeping the deer out. It says that they're restoring the grasslands. There's still problems there. There are deer problems. They're just not on the grasslands. They're next door in the woods. Next door, there used to be lots and lots of lowbush blueberry. There still is some lowbush blueberry. But every winter, the deer go in there and they crop the tops off of all those blueberry bushes. So they eat all of the buds and stuff that would open up the next year, and the plant has to start all over, growing new buds before it can pop out leaves and begin an active growth to store stuff in its roots for the winter. Asian jumping worms, they're up there, but they're not in the grasslands as far as I can see, but they're all around it in the woodlands. And they're pretty much doing a job on our woodlands by eating all of the leaf litter that should be building up there. That's home for a lot of different insects, other invertebrates, and so forth. And of course, there is the Japanese stilt grass. That's the big problem. Now, this is an especially big problem. I'm pretty much finished right now. Especially big problem right now because budget. This was not a big parks project. In fact, they only did this because they had a little bit of money left over from a different restoration project. And a couple of the people decided that we should give a trial, see if we can bring back this grasslands. Well, somebody's got to pay for that weeding. Somebody's got to pay for that monitoring for 5 years. And as you well know, parks budgets are endangered right now. They are very likely going to get cut significantly. And a project like this, I don't know if it will survive. It may survive if the people that are in charge of it have their hearts set on it and are willing to sacrifice and go in and keep it going. I think that's about all I can say about that. I just wanted to let you know what's happening. So thank you very much.